We continue the conversation now. In London, we see Dr. Ilan Kelman with us, Professor of Disasters and Health at University College of London, Reading in the UK. And we see Dr. Linda Spate, a flood forecasting expert. And Tom Burke joins us, the chairman of climate change think tank E3G. Linda, Dr. Spate, let me come to you first of all. Flood forecasting. Is it a great deal easier now than it was? Because it almost looks like the authorities in some of these European countries were caught by surprise.
Flood forecasting has really benefited from improvements in computer modelling and the amount of data that we have available for these kind of events. So we can feed all of that in together and we can get a much more advanced warning and more details of where that rainfall might fall. But flood forecasting on its own doesn't really solve any of these kind of events. It needs to be part of an integrated system. So I think Jeff's already touched on there the idea that we need to become more aware that we are living at risk, and in a climate change is going to make these events more frequent in the future. So that's something we need to be aware of. And we also can't see flood forecasting as something that's going to fix everything. It also needs to be considered alongside, big flood defence construction schemes, building in a more resilient way so our communities are more resilient to flooding, and also making people more aware that this is something that they need to take personal responsibility for.
Okay, so you can blame the people in the path of the flood, perhaps for building their houses there in the first place. But if you've got a runaway train and you know that it's coming, it's presumably up to the authorities to say, we must put these defences in place. Why have they not done so?
I think it's a thing about appreciating the scale of risk. So the problem with big flood events like this is they don't happen very often. It's quite easy on paper because we can produce excellent flood maps and we can draw a line around the area that's at risk of flooding and people can see, there is a risk of flooding in this area. But unless you've actually experienced a flood, and the devastation we saw in Germany last week just showed us kind of the power of water and the destruction it can cause. So hopefully this event's going to be a bit of a wake-up call to help the authorities and the policymakers think, actually, we need to be doing more about this and we need to think more about how prepared we are in advance of these events.
Well, let's at this moment pause and take a look at this chart here. You mentioned we can take a look and see what the history is and what the future might therefore hold. This is trends in flood losses in Europe over the past 150 years. You can see way, way down, 1870, 1900, 1920s, not much change. And then suddenly, round about the 1980s, it takes off. And it is a massive rise until about 2005. It drops off at that point and sort of seems to, well, it's not quite as bad as it was, but it's still much worse than it was in the early part of the 20th century. So, Ilan, let me ask you, A, how come? Is it simply down to climate change, or is this cyclical? And if it is dropping off a bit at the moment, is that a good thing?
Well, you're looking at a graph of flood losses. And for there to be losses, there has to be buildings and people in the way. What this means is that we have to look at how urban expansion has occurred. We have to look at the fact that people may be building different buildings and living in different places, and that they also will tend to have many more items, which are much more expensive. So there's actually not a very good correlation. There's not a very good connection between the amount of rainfall and the amount of flood losses. Almost all the increase in flood losses, the changes, are coming from changes in how many people we have, how they're living, and the amount of items which they have, as well as the values of their properties.
So you're saying this isn't down necessarily to the fact that we've been pumping too much into the atmosphere, warming it up, and that then causes the rain. It's the fact that we're ill prepared for it on the ground.
There is no doubt that we are causing the climate to change rapidly and substantively, and we need to stop that. When we are looking at the current flood disaster, which has been devastating and just taken far too many lives, we could have stopped all of it, and this is not down to climate change. This is down to stopping the disaster by where we live, how we live, ensuring that people are not vulnerable and are not in the way of dangerous floodwater, no matter what the climate is doing, and we are changing it a lot, but no matter what the climate is doing, we can stop flood disasters if we want to.
Well, we will come back and talk about where people live in just a moment, because not everybody has access to Mount Ararat. Not everybody can build an ark. You have to build some people where you don't have very much choice. But Tom, let me come to you. It seems to me that things are only going to get worse next time because the damage has already been caused. I've been caught up, probably for work, on a couple of hurricanes, and you know that once it's gone through, it's the back end of the hurricane that's going to cause more damage because it's circulating the other way. So is there any way that we can prevent this sort of thing causing more and more damage each time it happens?
We could stop burning fossil fuels, and that would stop the climate changing as fast as it is changing. And if the climate stopped changing, then we would have less these events taking place. But as Elon says, it's an interaction, an event that happens, that's climate-driven event, and then what we are doing and putting in the way of that event. And if we go on building houses in coastal zones, or we go on building houses on floodplains, then the amount of damage that these kind of events do will only grow. So you've got two factors working together: burning fossil fuels, which changes the climate, and then being unwise in the way we plan and build things that makes these events do much more expensive damage.
But is there any way you can mitigate against it tomorrow? Tom, you and I have had conversations before about what should be done in the long term, but even in the relatively short long term, what can be done right now?
Well, as Linda was saying, there's an awful lot of things we can do right now to actually mitigate them, improving our flood defenses, investing in flood defenses, which we can do right now. We can also do, and something again Linda was saying, we can improve our ability to forecast these measures. There's now a real effort underway to create the kind of supercomputing that would allow us to make climate-driven events as predictable as normal weather events. And that would allow the emergency services much more time to give people warning when these very extreme events occur. So yes, there are things we could do now. It means spending the money on doing them.
So Tom, given the fact that climate change, global warming, call it what you will, has received so much more attention in the last 15 years than it ever did before, do you notice various bodies deciding that they will be able to mitigate against the damage that these floods cause to the people who live in dangerous areas, some things that they can do tomorrow?
I don't see governments really anywhere doing enough to deal with the fact that we're going to have more of these events and they're going to be more aggressive. And right now, we need to be spending money on improving flood defenses, for instance, in improving the response times for emergency services, in getting people better prepared themselves to cope with the events. We can also do something to improve our ability to forecast these very extreme events, which are climate events, with the same kind of accuracy that we currently forecast weather events. So we have a better idea of giving advance warning to people of what might happen, so they can at least move out of the way of these very extreme consequences.
Elon, will that save lives?
That would certainly save lives, but no doubt at all about it. But if the climate goes on changing, we'll go on losing lives.
Okay, Tom, that was for Elon, but thanks for your answer. Will it save lives, many lives, Elon, do you think?
It's really up to everyone, from the individual up to the national government and then beyond that, in order to ensure that we're focusing on it. As you said earlier, we're all not going to move up a mountain. And if we did, then we might end up with other hazards which cause damage. The issue is about living with flooding. And exactly as Tom and Linda has said, when we get this torrential water, often the only thing to do is to get out in time, carrying all valuables, taking pets and other animals with you, taking items which you do not want to lose. There's a lot which can be done right now in terms of ensuring that people are ready, and there's a ready forecast for other storms coming in. And even in the near term, if we're talking weeks and months, to ensure that properties do not get terribly damaged when water enters them, and preferably do not get destroyed. So the focus absolutely has to be on stopping the disaster. We can get rainfall, we can get a storm, we can get a flood, but if we don't have a disaster, then we're doing okay. We have to save lives, but also ensure that people can go on living afterwards, because coming back to muddy flood water, having sat in your home for an hour or a day, is awful. It can be 6 to 12 months before that property can be properly inhabited again. That is devastating.
What do you make of the EFAS, the Euro Flood Awareness System? Is it fit for purpose?
It is absolutely part of what we need. As Linda said, it's not everything, but without it, it would be very hard for us to actually move forward. A warning has to come from people. And people have to know what's going on regarding the information, the data, the technology, and the different levels of communication. So EFAS is part of it. EFAS did an exceptional job in terms of knowing well in advance what might happen, but clearly there was a lot yet to improve in the wider scope, in the wider system, and this comes down to individuals, households, governments, and all of us working together to say, look, we now have the data that we need. How can we ensure that we still stop the disaster?
Let's take a look at some figures. Global flood damage roundabout now is $9.2 billion. By the end of this century, the European Commission's Joint Research Centre says it could be 56.6 billion. That is a multiple of 5 or even more than 6, actually. So Linda, it's cost effective in the long run, isn't it, to invest in the sort of technology that you would champion to make sure that those damage costs don't go even further?
Certainly. I mean, flood forecasting has been really shown to reduce the cost of taking action. So if you act before an event, it's cheaper, it's easier, and it's more efficient and more effective to do that. And one of the things we've been doing at the University of Reading is thinking how we can learn from our experiences in the UK and elsewhere and apply them kind of globally, because it's not just a Western problem, it's something that's going to affect all countries across the world. So how can we use flood forecasting models and take action in advance? And one of the ways that we have to do that, I think, which touches what Ellen was just saying, is to build confidence in those models so that when people get the flood forecasts and warnings, they then take action on them because in advance, they know that they can trust them, and that's going to help them if they follow that advice.
What do you make of the fact that you talk about rich countries, poor countries, that now that rich countries have been hit, it's getting far more headlines than it would do if it was a flood or a landslide in Bangladesh?
Well, I think this week there's actually been floods all over the world. The media attention's currently on Germany, so that gives us a good opportunity to start this conversation. But actually, organisations such as the Red Cross Climate Centre are already doing really great work in this area about anticipatory action. So I don't think it's something where we are, doing things here and then other people are learning from us. I think it's an international discussion, and we can all learn from each other and our own experiences.
Will we be able to, in the not too distant future, be able to predict the weather in the way that we can sort of predict that the clock's going to strike 1 o'clock, that we will be able to sort of program something into our smartphone and say, look, I really shouldn't be here in 6 weeks' time because there's going to be something terrible happening? Or are we always just victims of happenstance?
No, I don't think that's the case at all. I think even now we can say the forecasts are pretty good. In terms of the climate change projections, we knew that an event of this scale and magnitude could happen somewhere in Europe. So it wasn't unfathomable that we would see this level of impacts. And then in terms of the kind of event-based forecasting, as Jeff pointed out, we had those forecasts several days in advance. So I think we're already at the point where we can say, we shouldn't be in that area at that point in time. What we need to do better is to get that message across and ensure that people understand the forecast and take action when they get it.
Tom, are you discouraged or perversely perhaps encouraged when you find that rich countries now start moaning about the fact that there are these terrible floods when they shouldn't be in our area, but when they're in a different part of the world, well, that's okay, that now it's getting more attention, which is a good thing, but it's a terrible thing that's caused that?
Well, what's happening all over the world is that events are validating what the scientists have been saying for a very long time. And that's quite important because that will drive the politics to do something about the changing climate. And the thing about the changes is there are surprises out there in climate change. We don't know all the things that are going to happen. The current sequence of events at the moment, we've got fires and droughts and floods all happening at the same time, is surprising a lot of the people, a lot of the scientists who've been studying this for 30 years, because these things are happening faster and are more difficult to deal with than they thought. There are probably more surprises out there. So it's really important that what's happening now is these events are beginning to drive public opinion to ask more from politicians.
Well, I've got a note down here from one of our producers. You said to her, if you don't change things, next time it is going to be a great deal worse. And I'm wondering, therefore, does it have to take something of almost biblical, if you like, proportions, as opposed to sort of localized flooding in Germany? Is it going to take something like an earthquake or a flood in a major metropolitan area to make everybody say, well, actually, people like Tom, they're right. We should do something now?
we're all in this. It's not only politicians who have to respond. We all have to play our different parts in dealing with it. But there's not a problem even now with public awareness. The real problem is how the politicians are responding to that awareness, and they're not doing enough fast enough to actually reduce the risks that we've been talking about.
But it is now a vote winner, isn't it? I mean, if you ignore climate change, then you're quite likely to be voted out.
I think that's increasingly the case, but also you should see this enormous opportunities in decarbonizing our energy system. It's going to create an enormous amount of economic opportunity. It's going to reduce the wasted heat, for instance, that's causing the problem. It's not doing anything for the economy. It's going to create lots of jobs for people to do. Lots of investment is going to be needed. All of that means if we take an opportunity-driven view of this as well as a risk-driven view, then we're getting things that are sort of win-win.
Okay, Elon, this program is all about today. It's all about, if not today, then tomorrow, by the end of the week. It's not 50 years down the line. Our politicians, our scientists, is the general public cottoning on quick enough to be able to row back from this?
Well, let's work together to do it. Whether a journalist or a scientist, we need to be dealing with today, but we need to be dealing with the next century. Part of doing that is also thinking about yesterday, but also thinking about the last century. A lot of what we're seeing regarding the floods and the fires, and even to some extent the heat waves, is actually not that new. Taking an historical perspective, we can go back and find very similar floods, very similar fires, and to some extent heat waves, but they weren't as devastating because there weren't so many people living in the same places. Conversely, we know that climate change is going to cause massively mortal heat waves because it's going to push heat into realms where we cannot survive outdoors. When we look at the figures for heat, when we look at what is going to happen to people, then suddenly it becomes imminent, it becomes urgent, and it becomes absolutely horrifyingly lethal. So work with us to come on here and talk about 10 years, 50 years, and 100 years, as well as today, tomorrow, and next week.
Thank you very much. Indeed, you talk about climate change and heat temperatures, reading just before I came into this studio about London in 10, 15 years' time being as hot as the capital of Saudi Arabia was 50, 60 years ago. That is absolutely terrifying. And it is a very hot day outside today. Listen, thank you very much indeed. Elon, Linda, Tom, thank you for coming on the program, and to Jeff DaCosta, who we spoke to at the very top of the show. Our thanks, and our thanks also to you for watching. I'm David Foster from me and the Roundtable team. Until next time, goodbye.